Thanks for coming tonight. This event at the Wheeler Centre is going to be a conversation with writers Rodney Hall and Darryl Emerson about a writer who, like many artists over the centuries, was not really celebrated in her own time, Christina Stead. Best known for her book, I guess, The Man Who Loved Children, but I've been reading Letty Fox, Her Luck, and I know that Rodney has another favourite as well. I mean, she's a remarkable writer, and she had huge interests, and that's what we're going to be talking about tonight. Rodney Hall, of course, is one of our most eminent writers, twice won the Miles Franklin Award and the Australian Literature Society Gold Medal, 36 books of his, including novels and poems and biographies, social commentary. In 1991, he was appointed for a 3-year term as chairman of the Australia Council, so he does know a lot about Australian literature, and he's been responsible for Australian literature, and he's a fan of Christina Stead. Darryl Emerson, here closer to me, is a playwright whose play I Write What I See, Christina Stead Speaks, was performed last year in Melbourne, so you may have seen it at Trades Hall. Last year, Melbourne University Press reissued The Man Who Loved Children, that grey one, and that novel had a new introduction by American writer Jonathan Franzen, who was here for the Melbourne Writers' Festival in August. He wrote a piece for the New York Times praising Stead's novel, saying, "It's the kind of book that if it's for you, it's really for you." He says, "I'm convinced that there are tens of thousands of people in this country," that's America, "who would bless the day the book was published if only they could be exposed to it." Jonathan Franzen, I've said before, is a really good citizen of the literary world, and he's done quite a lot. And Paula Fox is another writer that he resurrected when he found a copy of her book in somebody's holiday house once when he was having a holiday at the beach, I think. Saul Bellow was a fan of Christina Stead. He said, "Christina Stead is really marvellous. She gropes here, she gropes there, she introduces this subject and that subject, seems to talk to no purpose, talk and talk and talk. Then suddenly with a wild outburst she understands something. A discovery has been made." The Man Who Loved Children was first published 70 years ago, and it was a fictional expression really of her own childhood. In her biography of Christina Stead, Hazel Rowley, who is a late great friend of mine, reveals that Stead was often in tears writing The Man Who Loved Children because it was so distressing for her to reflect on her upbringing. I first read Christina Stead at about 16. Of course, a wonderful teacher gave it to us to read as a group. So, and I remember being absolutely stunned by this book. This book was about a family that wasn't a happy family, and it was about a father that wasn't a beloved father, and I thought, you know, I didn't realise that you're allowed to write like that. What about you, Rodney? When did you come to Christina Stead? What was the first thing you read?
Well, that was the first thing I read. I tried reading The Seven Poor Men of Sydney and couldn't warm to it. But well, it's too long ago to remember, Ramona. But once I got onto The Man Who Loved Children, I was sold. I was just saying to you a moment ago, in preparation for this morning, I dipped into it. Fatal. Like hours later, I'm thinking, I must stop reading. I must close this book. I've got things to do today. When she gets hold of you, she doesn't let go. But it was a great pleasure to have met her, and I had a little bit to do with it. In a tangential kind of way, she changed my life, really. I was at the Australian National University in 1968 as a creative arts fellow. And that was a 15-month fellowship, so it went into 69. And I left just before Christina arrived. That's when she came back to Australia. She went to Canberra. But I did meet her soon after that. And anyway, she very kindly read a book of mine, which was published under the name A Place Among People. And among other things, she was saying, she said, "Oh, I really enjoyed your book," and so on. She was very large, I have to say. She was very tall and big-boned and sort of somewhat craggy. And she had this blunt manner, which was part of her warmth. She was a very warm and wonderful person, but she was withdrawn from you. She kept a distance. And she was saying, yes, I read the book. And she said, it's very difficult to write an interesting book about a dull character. And when I came to write the next book, I had her in mind. And I thought, Christina, I'm going to pack this book with so many interesting characters. And that was a turning point for me, because that was Just Relations, and that was my break into the international market. And really, an awful lot of what I was doing in that book was writing it for Christina, because although I didn't know her well, she was the one who kind of pulled me up about... And it's how I escaped realism. I mean, up till then I'd done 3 realist novels, 2 of them published. And I kind of decided that was the moment of break. So she was very important to me. And then this is a sort of double-barreled reminiscence. And like my books tends to go on, like her books tends to go on. Some years later, I was having lunch with her and Judith Wright in University House in Canberra, and she said, "Oh, what are you writing at the moment?" And I said, "Oh, I'm nearly finished, and I'm writing a book I'm having so much fun with, which was that book, Just Relations, which is about old people who in a little village who are refusing the National Trust permission to give their village that badge. They don't want the tourists." And she said, "But you were writing that when I spoke to you last. That must be 2 years ago." And I said, yes, it's taken me 5 years. She said, "What's taking you so long?" And I said, "Well, it's 500 pages. She said, "Oh, well, that shouldn't be an obstacle." Then she looked at me, she said, "You're not revising." And that was, to me, an absolute key to reading her own books. They're not revised. And it's what's wonderful about them. I mean, the people who complain, the sort of critics, and there are a lot of them, who say that the books get lost in digressions. They are digressions. They're not stories. They are fabulous insights into the human condition.
All right,
and a depth that almost nobody else reaches.
I'll put a full stop there.
Yeah,
and we'll see if everyone agrees with that. But Darryl, what about you? What was your first meeting with Christina Stead on the page?
On the page. The first book of hers that I read was For Love Alone, which probably remains my favourite of her books, actually. And then I read The Salzburg Tales, which I thought were quite remarkable. And then I read 7 Poor Men of Sydney, which I enjoyed. Then I read The Man Who Loved Children, which I admired reluctantly, rather than liked, I must say.
Reluctant? Because?
Yes, to me it's a masterful book, of course, but to me in the category of books like Moby Dick or the last volume of The Fortunes of Richard Marnie, excruciatingly painful and tragic and cruel to a great degree.
And funny, though.
That's where I don't quite. Black comedy and I always just see the black. I'm sorry. I'm a mild person who seriously, who's not doesn't take too much of that. And so The Man Who Loved Children I admired reluctantly, as I say, and then later when I decided to do the play, I read all her other books and her letters and her stories, which I think are quite wonderful. In some ways I think the shorter form is, well, she's great as a novelist and perhaps even greater as a short story writer, in my opinion. So they were my first knowledges of her.
So, with The Man Who Loved Children, she starts writing it. I mean, that's the most well-known, I think, of her works. She starts writing it towards the end of 1938. She's 36. She's living in a dreary New York apartment with Bill Blake, who is her partner. He's married, I think, to somebody else at the time, but they're very much
with a daughter
together. And she thinks that this book demands to be written. It's not her first book, though. I mean, you'd think that you might use that sort of story to be the first thing you write. Do you know why she took so long to get around to it?
Oh, I think it's painful to her.
Yeah.
I mean, the book is agonising that Louis...
You want to describe it to people just in case you haven't...
Well, fundamentally, it's a book about a household war that is conducted between a mother, Henny, and the father, Sam. I might give you a tiny taste of Henny, do you think? Because it's important to see what sort of writer this is we're talking about. If there's anyone here who hasn't read her, you have a tremendous treat in store for you. This is how we very first meet Henny, who is the mother. Henny, here we go. The children grabbed tricks and ideas according to the need of the day, without thinking at all where they got them, without gratitude. And Henny saw this, and so didn't bother her head about her children. She herself belonged to a grabbing breed. Henny would also tell fortunes by the cards over her tea, though never for the children. While she was dealing to tell the fortune of Aunt Bonnie, Sam's 25-year-old sister and their unpaid maid-of-all-work, or Miss Spearing, Henny's old maid friend from school days, she would always begin with a wonderful yarn about how she went to town more dead than alive and with only 10 cents in my purse and I wanted to crack a safe, and how in the streetcar was a dirty shrimp of a man with a fishy expression who purposely leaned over me and pressed my bust, and a common vulgar woman beside him, an ogress big as a hippopotamus, with her bottom sticking out, who grinned like a shark and tried to give him the eye, and how this wonderful adventure went on for hours, always with new characters of new horror. In it would invariably be a woman with a cow-like expression, a girl looking frightened as a rabbit, a yellow-haired frump with hair like a haystack in a fit, some woman who bored Henny with her silly gassing, and impudent, flighty young girls behind counters, and waitresses smelling like a tannery who gave her the lip which caused her to go to market and give them more than they bargained for. There were men and women, old acquaintances of hers or friends of Sam, who presumed to know her, to whom she would give the go-by or the cold shoulder or a distant bow or a polite good day or a black look or a look black as thunder. And there were silly old roosters, creatures like a dying duck in a thunderstorm, with filthy paws, and YMCA sick chickens, and women thin as a rail and men fat as a pork barrel, and women with blouses so puffed out that she wanted to stick pins in, and men like coal heavers, and women like boiled owls, and women who'd fallen into a flour barrel, and all these wonderful creatures who swarmed in the streets, stores and restaurants of Washington, ogling, leering, pulling, pushing, stinking, over-scented, screaming and boasting, turning pale at a black look from Henny, ducking and diving, dodging and returning, were the only creatures that Henny ever saw.
Isn't that fantastic? You know, her publisher, Simon & Schuster, insisted she set the book in the United States, yes. Although she wanted it to be set in Australia. Yep. And Hazel Rowley said that if there was a weakness in the book, she thought it was that transposition to America. What do you think about that?
Well, look, that's interesting. She and Bill sort of diligently researched the geography, the tides, everything of Chesapeake Bay to get the locale absolutely right. Now, there's something a bit strained about that as an idea, it seems to me, and the book does seem, opinions differ, to be partly at least based upon her own life in Sydney early, and some American critics found the book strangely not American, despite all this incredibly conscientious research, and some Australian researchers found it not Australian, because the intuitive Australian qualities had been diligently covered up by all the conscientious research. Now, there is a curious sort of inauthentic element to the location of that book, I think. Emotionally, it's absolutely passionate and convincing, as Rodney's just demonstrated, but I think there is something a bit unconvincing about the setting of it.
Wasn't it sad that she had to stick it in America? I mean, that's the fate of Australian literature for a long time.
And it didn't work. I mean, the book of hers that was a success, which I think is her other great masterpiece, is House of All Nations. And it's very curious to me how so often writers' very best works are the ones that are very much the hardest to find. I mean, the other day I was in a bookshop to buy The Autumn of the Patriarch for a friend of mine, saying, in my view, the greatest book written in the 20th century. They had every Gabriel Garcia Marquez book you could imagine except The Autumn of the Patriarch, because when I spoke to the bookseller, she said, well, we never sell it. And it's like that every time there's an edition of Christina, and the previous one to the current one was a Sirius Angus and Robertson. They finally did House of All Nations after having done just about everything else. And oddly enough, it was the one that was successful in her own time. And it is fabulous.
Tell us about the story. That's about the bank, isn't it?
It's about a bank. It's about it's set in Paris, and it's about a merchant bank, an investment bank, run by two immensely elegant and sophisticated brothers, the Berthiaud brothers. It could be. It's the GFC. It's about this. It's a huge torrent of characters, but mainly kind of wheeler dealers and rich people. And bank people, and they are fabulously grotesque and fabulously vulgar and fabulously flimsy as characters. And the bank itself, this extremely elegant building and high-profile bank, turns out to be nothing but vapour in the end. By the time you get to the end of the book, you realise it's all been smoke and mirrors. That this is the nature of how finance at that level is run, and it's totally pertinent to today.
She worked in the bank.
She did.
Yes, she met Bill.
Yes,
I think that's where the setting thing is. She worked in Paris in a bank in the 30s. That's where she met Bill, and she was fascinated by international finance, and she was very influenced by Balzac's novels, many of which are about crazy financial schemes and businessmen with nonsensical delusions that sweep other people into them. So she was very well placed to write this very fine book. Yeah. But again, that's where I think that the source and the result are very well connected in that book, and they're not always in all her books, I don't think.
No, but it does lack the one thing, though. I mean, I do think it's a wonderful book. It's a highly readable book, House of All Nations. So the first chapter is a bit of an obstacle, I think, for the reader coming to her afresh, because the characters are not actually separately introduced. So you have to get into the book before you realise who those people were at the beginning. She doesn't lead you in by the hand, but once it gets going, then you never mistake who they are. And it's like reading with a high wind at your back. It's fantastic. But it doesn't have the underlying injury, the sense of injury that is the soul of The Man Who Loved Children. It's a totally...
Which is her father, which is the relationship with her father.
And her mother.
Her mother died when she was a baby.
A kind of abandonment in a way, too.
Yes. And she had a lot of half siblings.
Yes.
And her father just told her she was ugly and big and unattractive. She'd never find a man.
Well, I think that experience. I mean, her mother died when she was 2, and then for 5 years there were a succession of people came to help the father look after her and look after the house. For a while, the father's sister, Aunt Florence, came and lived with them for a while, and then she got married herself, and then the father remarried, and fairly quickly there were 5, I think, children for her. So she was, I mean, if you want to look at it in psychoanalytic and developmental terms, she was displaced by the series of other children who followed. And in a way, I felt when I was writing my play that there's an element almost like a fairy tale. She had a stepmother, and in a way, not necessarily a wicked stepmother, but she felt like the person pushed aside. And this element, in my view, of her having a close relationship with the father in the early years, and in a way I think she was always the apple of his eye in a certain way, that they had a very intense, I think he had a great regard for her mind. He taught her a lot, and she always respected and liked that part of him.
He was a scientist, wasn't he?
Yes, a marine biologist. And she also, I think, she often described herself as a naturalist writer, and with my play I called it I Write What I See, which is if to say, in her view, as one of her phrases, I'm just describing what I see. But if she sees the sort of thing that Rodney has just described, that is not like a telescope or a microscope. There's a certain
kaleidoscope.
Yes, there's a coloured vision there. But her conscious view of herself was as a naturalist. She was a daughter of a scientist. She often said, I'm a daughter of the Enlightenment. And so and in spiritual terms, she described herself as a rationalist. She had great contempt for organised religion and did not believe in life after death, deities, churches or anything like that. And all these things are very interesting in the kind of books that she produces.
What about the language that she writes? I mean, the word play that she attributes to her father. Was he really like that?
Well,
or had she been reading Joyce?
Well, no, it's the opposite of Joyce in a way. It's a very good point, Ramona. I mean, the father is plainly reflects her own father, though I know nothing about her biography. I'm one of those people who doesn't want to know about writers' biographies. I'm not interested. I'm interested in the books. But that's what the father, Sam Pollitt, is like in The Man Who Loved Children. He's a scientist, left school early but worked his way up, and he is a sort of health fanatic and a common sense fanatic and a man of the Enlightenment and so on. But he speaks baby talk to the babies. And it's odious. It's absolutely creepy odious. But you can see at the same time that he doesn't get that at all. He thinks he's beloved by everybody and tremendous fun with everybody and talking everybody's language. So there's, because she's such a marvellous writer, it's what makes her a profound writer, is she can keep many balls in the air at the same time. In each of these characters, she's not judging them, but she's showing you them in a kind of three-dimension that, you know, short of Tolstoy, I'm not sure anyone's ever reached. It's, you have an astounding sense of the inner-outer realities of the people, the children as well, in the book.
How can you say you're not interested in a writer's life, though, when you just said that, you know, this guy in this book is very much like her father?
No, I was just saying that it sounds from the description of what her father was like.
But it is, yes. But
well, I don't care that's the origin. I'm just saying all I care about is Sam Pollitt. I don't care about Mr. Stead at all.
But the line is blurred because that, as you rightly say, odious baby talk that he uses towards Lulu, who's Christina Stead, that sections of that were actually taken from letters that the father wrote to her, which he then incorporated in a book about herself and her father. So the biographical and literary lines are sort of pretty blurred there. But
you are interested in a writer's life.
Of course. Well, I
But
am,
why?
yes.
Why are you and why isn't he?
I think it's, look, they're all legitimate points of view, I think. I mean, I guess being a playwright and wanting to tell the story of a writer and the story behind the writer, naturally I'll absorb all the biographical things I can grab from anywhere, trying to make sense of a million disconnected and interesting facts. But it's equally legitimate and perhaps more satisfying not to have to bother with that in a way and just read the books as autonomous and interesting works.
Yeah, it's not a bother. I mean, I actually think it's a mechanistic, not personally to you, but I think it's a mechanistic view of the universe to think you can take something apart to see how it works. I'm sorry, works of art don't work like that. They're synoptic things that happen in the round, and it's when they engage the subconscious, and in the case of The Man Who Loved Children, the subconscious is like a tidal wave under you as you read. I mean, she's engaged on every level at the greatest intensity. In fact, when you read the book, and I reread it only about 2 years ago, going from one kind of household catastrophe to another, all the incidents, by the way, are very normal little kind of household incidents for a large family. As you go from one catastrophe to another and one complication to another, I have to say, I got to like the last 40 pages thinking, how on earth is she going to finish this book? I mean, short of doing a sort of Oblomov and just dropping it and saying, well, I can't finish it, so it just goes off into space, which is a good way of going, actually.
And there's the nuclear bomb.
She does.
On everybody.
She pulls out of the hat the most heart-stopping finish. And it's done for a book that is so efflorescent and incandescent with language. It's done in such a low-key way. It's absolutely heart-stopping and really tremendous. I mean, how many books, like, for example, Moby Dick's been mentioned, another great book with, again, a lumpy book. She's a lumpy writer, and the lumps and bumps are where the life is. You know, the last thing you want would be to let an editor loose on her. She doesn't need that. She is a writer of lumps and bumps, and there's all the energies in those collected things. And Melville was like that too. But and although he begins Moby Dick fabulously, well, maybe he ends it fabulously. Come to think of it, he ends it fabulously too. Don't worry, that's not a good example.
Can I bring another example in here? Let's talk about Letty Fox, Her Luck, which was published in 1946 in New York and banned in Australia for its salaciousness. This is almost, a slice of Christina Stead's, the next part of her life, when she was a 24-year-old or so.
Well, she was a very daring writer in that book, Daring for the Time. And one of the things I liked about Bill, one of the many things I liked about Bill, her husband, was that when the book was banned and she was attacked back in her home country, he defended her and said, Colette has not written better than you about women, George Eliot hasn't, and certainly not Virginia Woolf. You've done it. And I liked his support for her, and he always supported and inspired her in many ways. But it was strange that Australia was the only country that banned it, and she was pretty furious, to use a clear word about that.
It's a kind of Sex in the City set in sort of 1946.
Yes,
I mean, she was, writing about young women who are sexually active and had all kinds of lovers and married lovers. And,
that was not the way you were supposed to write about those subjects, and not the way a woman should write about those subjects at the time. But she went straight ahead and did it. And she had a lot of intellectual daring, which I really admire.
Well, I mean, the thing about that I think offended the authorities was that she writes about it as she would write about any other subject.
Yes, that's right.
There's no sense of judgment or guiding the reader as to what to think, or this is an immoral woman that he's introducing you to. She just gets on with it because it's life. And she puts it on the page. And
well, that's that objectivity as she saw it, and naturalism that she said she was committed to. Once she chose her subject, there it was, fully and as vital as she could make it.
And I think this is funny too, this book too. I mean, I don't know whether you think it's not funny.
Look, I think one of the effects of my studying her life was actually to make me less amused by her books, interestingly.
That's your point.
Another good reason.
Well, that's interesting, you see. No, that's not necessarily a loss, because, with all due respect, because I became much more sympathetic towards her than I first was. As I felt I understood her, I was less amused and entertained by her, but much more interested and moved by her, which I hadn't expected to feel on reading these first ferociously vital books. And I think, this is a brief personal thing here, I think I've tried, as a playwright, you're trying to think, how would this person seem if they came into the room? And this helps the actors to understand it and all that kind of thing. And the forthrightness, which you've mentioned, this kind of, well, what are you on about, sort of quality, which was a bit off-putting to some people. Underneath that, I felt she was actually a very sensitive and shy person, and in a way that's pretty often found, she concealed that with a forthright, going on the offensive kind of man.
And how did you find that bit out?
Well, that's partly an intuitive thing, but also partly through reading accounts by her friends. She was often quite shy in company. There's an interesting part when she and Bill got together, and she said in one of her letters, "We're giving a little party. I haven't done this before." And it's just a lady of 35, 36. That's you think, never done that before, all right. And she was quite excited about it, and she shyly bought all the right things and had a very nice time. Now that's some of the personal side, as opposed to this incredibly intellectually courageous, passionate writer. Now one doesn't undermine or supplant the other. They're all parts of an evolving truth from my point of view as a playwright, both the artist in her works and the artist when she's not in her works, just being a person. Now I hope that all connects with you. And so this to me is how I try to understand the character. So as I say, I'd be interested to see now. The play was on about a year ago. And I'd read so many of her books in 2 or 3 years, I decided to have a break for a little while. But I might go back to one or two in the next couple of years and see how they affect me again this time. But certainly my view of her changed quite considerably through reading her life and her letters and all the books about her, as well as all the books by her. So, and I should also say, Ramona's also mentioned Hazel Rowley's very fine biography. Now look, I'm not prone to make, I don't think, many dogmatic statements, but I'll make one now. This is one of the great biographies in Australian literature and perhaps in world literature. So if you haven't read it, there's a treat for you there. So no, I really wouldn't delay if you haven't read that book. It's a tremendously good book. So you probably know that already. But
I think you said to me when we spoke earlier this week that you didn't recognise Carmen Khalil's portrait of
not at all.
Of Christina Stead in Letty Fox,
yes.
And Carmen Khalil introduces it, and Australian, of course, the Australian publisher who went to London and published Virago books, and sort of came and talked about coming as a feminist publisher to talk to Christina Stead about feminism, and she was. I mean, I think she gave her a short shrift. I mean, I believe she liked blokes quite a lot and wasn't really what you call a woman's woman, perhaps. But she was famously very difficult to interview, and one of my the colleagues at the ABC was Rodney Weatherall, and he did an interview with Christina Stead. Now, I couldn't hear it, but I saw an account of it, and it sounds excruciating, was it? I mean, you've heard it.
Well, look, I think she... This is part of the mystery of people. I mean, she was a great writer, but I think she was... I mean, everybody has different experiences of people, but I never met her. I've seen a video of a TV interview with her, which is very interesting, but done in old age, when she was about 75, 76. But I think, looking back and trying to imagine her as a playwright does, when a person is 10, when they're 17, when they're 28, when they're 42, when they're 59, when they're 81, I think she was a shy person she felt uneasy with people often as a first approach.
But her initial response seemed to be saying no to everything.
Well, but
you bolt something up and she'd say no.
Yeah, well, that actually kind of indicates what I'm getting at. It was too much too quickly. She had to steal up to people, and I think people had to kind of, in my opinion, and not having met her, they had to disarm her before she could feel, right, I can really trust this person and they're not going to get at me. I can actually relax a bit. And that took quite a while on many occasions, in my view.
Maybe it was easy for me because all but one time that I saw her, we were in company with Judith Wright, and Judith was already very seriously deaf. And Christina was so marvellously sensitive to that, and included her always, was very careful that Judith had picked up what was being said, had not missed something, and so she sort of took her under her wing in a way, although Judith was a very forceful and powerful person in her own right, but it was very subtly done, and it may have been that I got a different view of her than I would have had Judith not been there, but she was terribly nice to me, and on what basis I have no idea, but I thought she was wonderful. And
English writer Tim Parks says that he can think of no author for whom milieu was more important than for Christina Stead, no author who worked harder and longer to create the social settings of her novel. And I think, Darryl, you've described the research. He says, no doubt this endeavour came out of her being so frequently forced to change milieu herself, and thus to appreciate how absolutely different one world was from another, because she meets Bill in London. She soon after she comes from Sydney. He wanted her to move to Paris to be near his family.
Yeah.
So he can see.
They were in New York, the family.
I thought that... Anyway, all right.
Sorry.
According to Tim, they were in Paris for a bit. In Paris, she spoke French. She then went to New York, to Spain, and then the war broke out, the Civil War. Belgium, London, back to New York. So she's making copious notes, apparently, wherever she is. She's trying to create worlds.
But how is this different from anybody else? I mean, you could say exactly that about Patrick White, with Greece and North Africa and the war and everything else. I mean, I don't see he's saying anything that...
I think he's also... He was
we all
also,
travel.
Yeah, but she was living, and it was hard life, wasn't it?
Well, look, it's interesting when he says forced to change. I mean, I think some of the changes were forced, but some of them were quite voluntary too. And she just went where they both decided they should go.
But they were forced out of America, weren't they?
Yes,
really,
that's true, because they were left-wingers. That's true, and the whole political side is quite important in both their lives as well.
Well, let's talk about her in politics.
Well, she was a left-leaning writer, and he was a Marxist, her companion and husband, and as the 30s wore on and fascism seemed to be taking over in Europe, he was Jewish also, they felt they should go back to the United States. And so they were kind of exiled from Europe. Then they were there for 5 or 6 years, I think. But then the anti-communist thing came up, and the McCarthy era, the House of Un-American Activities. So then they thought they should go back to Europe because America was getting too hard to be in. So they're being pushed around by larger forces and in a way becoming sort of wanderers. And one of the feelings I had as I considered her life was that initially she wanted to travel. She's a very cosmopolitan writer in an old-fashioned sense, if you like, and she was very much at ease everywhere. But after a while these changes became too many. They were too abrupt, too painful, too frequent. And so she began to feel a bit sort of, oh, we're never going to settle, we're never going to have a home of our own, and so on. And I think a certain kind of sadness came into her, I think, about those sorts of things. And that's partly to do with the political and historical events that they were both affected by. And those things, again, are not directly relevant to reading her books, though her last book, I'm Dying Laughing, is partly about that. So there again, one thing does illuminate the other.
When she came back to Australia after her husband died, what was the reception?
Well, look, of her or by her?
The reception of
her.
Of her.
Well, Patrick White had a huge amount to do with all that. I mean, to have said when he was given the Nobel Prize, this is later, of course, but having said that she should have got it before him, and I think he was right, and he meant it. It wasn't just a compliment, but he was very much. I mean, again, I kind of knew him about as much as I knew her, not well. But right from I think the very first time I met him, we were, in a demonstration together, and he gave me an earful about Christina Stead and how she was not properly appreciated, and I hadn't read enough of her. He gave me a right drubbing for not having read enough Christina. But so she had her partisans, but she's still not.
Yeah, I mean, look, just to add something to that, I mean, my impression again was that when Bill died, she was 66, and they'd had this wandering life, and she really missed him. She did not like being a widow at all. Her deeply devoted life companion was no more. Now, she was a bit at a loose end for several years, really. She got some recognition from Australia and some from America. Then the idea, one of her relatives in Sydney, and she left Sydney 40 years before, said, look, if you came back to Sydney, we could probably put you up for a while till you find your feet. Now, that was very nice of them because they had not parted on good terms, she and they, many years before. They'd kept in touch and so on. But I get the impression that it wasn't particularly cordial, the relations. And so she had to decide whether to come back. And when she did come back, she got quite a good, as you rightly say, she had her very strong partisans here. And I remember reading articles in the 70s and 80s about her. And but I think she came back as a distinguished elderly writer and rather a lonely woman. That's a bit of a paradox, you see. And so people wanted to get to know her, but her shyness, I think, and her grief affected how much at ease she felt being back in her own country. And that's natural enough too.
No, I'm sure she's absolutely right. She was a very lonely woman. But on the other subject, the political one, I mean, in House of All Nations, right at the beginning of it, one of the bankers, Jules, talking to somebody, and this person is saying to him, what sort of employees do you want in this very high-profile bank? And he said, oh, well, the two best kind of employees are either dull people or communists. If they're dull people, they just do what you tell them and they don't make trouble. And if they're communists, they're grateful to you for giving them a job. So, but all the way through that book, the political thing you've raised, that's a very political book. It's got masses of information about Mussolini and Hitler and so on. And it's, this is before the Second World War. This is before they rose to their ultimate power. And so she sews into it a huge amount of contemporary reference, all of it highly politically charged. The people in the book discuss these political figures, she turns out, in hindsight, to have been very much on the right side of what was happening there. very, very critical of Mussolini and the things that he was praised for, and extremely critical of Hitler. So it's very, you know, she was very political.
Mm.
Now, I see that it's nearly 7 o'clock and the lady and gentleman with the microphones have just sidled up here, and that means it's time for you to tell us about your Christina Stead story, or what book that you would like to talk about, and maybe it's not one of the ones we've mentioned yet, that's fine. If you've got a question or a statement, or just to keep to knock around the Christina Stead story, just put your hand up and just wait till one of the ushers gives you a microphone. So what about it? I'm sure, yes, there's one person up there. Good on you.
Thanks very much for a really interesting discussion. I know you mentioned that Christina Stead wasn't really a woman's woman, and I'm not disagreeing with that, but I wonder whether or not you regard her as, in any sense, a feminist writer. I mean, to me, she does have strong feminist elements in her work, but also at the same time quite a virulent misogyny in some instances, and that's one of the really interesting complexities about her work. But I wonder whether you agree that there are both those sorts of strands in her work, or whether you think she's one or the other, a feminist or a misogynist.
That's a pretty good question. Ramona?
Well, I mean, of course, yes. I mean, she was a feminist writer. She wrote about fantastic female characters. She highlighted, you know, the position of women in those families. She broke apart sort of assumptions about life and sex and love and passion and devotion and just because Carmen Khalil didn't regard her as fitting into that kind of shape at that time, which was the 70s, I guess, and there were some pretty rigid shapes that you were supposed to be in the 70s about whether you were feminist or not feminist. But, you know, no, I mean, I think she's great. But I think she probably found that whole idea of being boxed in rather annoying and mysterious.
I do too. I mean, there's a real parallel, having mentioned Judith Wright, and Judith was a very, very dear close friend of mine for many years, and the godmother of my children. Judith hated being thought to be a kind of campaigner for an ecologist or a greenie or anything else. She made her own decisions. That's what they happened to be. And she fought, as we know, for the Barrier Reef and all those things. But she wouldn't join anything. She led things, but she didn't join them. And she didn't like being boxed in as that. And likewise, Gwen Harwood, to mention another wonderful Australian poet, Gwen Harwood once walked off a platform at a festival that I was at because she was introduced as a woman poet. And she got up and walked off. And later she said, I'm a poet, and I don't want to be called a woman poet. I'm a woman and I'm a poet. Now, Christina was, within a year, the same age as my mother. My mother, who brought us up as she being a single parent, you know, in most ways, my mother was incredibly strong about, you know, the unfairness of the lot that women had in society, and the importance of being independent, and all those things that are the bedrock of what became feminism. Nevertheless, if you'd asked her, was she a feminist, she would have been a bit puzzled. And if you'd asked her, did she believe in feminism, she would almost certainly have said no. That the idea of codifying what it was, and I think Christina was very like that, the idea of codifying what it was and analysing it and having a kind of, you know, as we know, feminist studies will show us all sorts of interesting ways of looking at, like, film language and things, like people shown in mirrors have a sort of reading in feminist theory. That sort of thing, I think Christina wouldn't have had a bar of.
And I don't know whether she felt a little bit sort of miffed because she was being approached as someone who was unrecognised by a young feminist publisher who was going to rescue her from history, which might have been a bit annoying. But on the other hand, she sold a lot of books when she was found.
Yes,
by
and Randall
Verlaine.
Jarrell should be mentioned at least.
Oh yes, well, mention him.
Well, I mean, this American poet and critic wrote a 50-page essay on her, which was published as the foreword to the revival of her books, and I think it's titled something like An Unknown Book, which can't have been comfortable for her, but it was a brilliant, brilliant analysis of the book. tremendously passionate and tremendously searching.
I'd like you to talk more about why you think she wasn't recognised. I was lucky enough to go to university in the days when we studied Australian literature, so I read Patrick White and Henry Handel Richardson, but I never heard of Christina Stead until I started writing a blog a few years ago, and people talked about her to me, and Americans actually. So what I'd like to know is why, if she didn't even get academic recognition from academics. I went to university in the 70s, 80s.
I know I've been talking, but this is the question I've been waiting for.
Oh, well, go for it.
No, so that
Don't let me stop.
That is, I'm sorry, Darryl, but that is straight into my court, because I think that's enormously important. I think there is a very straightforward answer to it, that people have lost the art of reading. She takes the reader on a really tough workout. You have to, they're not just big, they're dense. And it's exhilarating when you engage with it, but it takes real engagement. And on the whole, and this doesn't apply to all the books, but the great books, in my view, are nothing to do with plots at all. They're not stories. They are catalogues of, they're kind of cataracts of events and characters. And the lazy reader, the shallow reader, and in many ways the modern reader, I'm sorry to say, is looking for signposts to guide them through. What has this got to do with the story? Where am I? What am I supposed to be thinking about these people? She won't give you any of that. And I think the reason that people find her difficult is they don't give time to it. I hope the little bit I read to you is totally accessible. Funny, vivacious, electrically charged, but don't expect to get anywhere with it. It's the sort of writing that you don't want to page turn, you actually don't want the page to ever end. And it's a kind of reading that is profoundly out of fashion. I think it's bound to come back, because great works of art do. But I do think that with the cycle of time, it's requiring a kind of reading that it's very hard to find readers prepared to give it the space and energy. But if you do, it's fabulous.
What do you think, Darryl?
I think that's a pretty good reply to the question. I mean, I think you do have to surrender to her books a bit, and again, I think that's partly related to her theory of creativity. She often, when she was asked why she chose a certain subject, she'd say, lots of ideas present themselves, but only when I have the occasional depth charge, is her term, do I capitulate to what it demands of me. And thereupon she felt, taking up Rodney's word cataract, like a torrent swept her away, and all she could do was follow it till it exhausted herself. And that's partly why she disliked any idea of revision, because, as Heraclitus says, the same river cannot flow in the same way twice. The river had carried her along and landed her on the bank, and that was it. So she couldn't go back and pretend it was about to all happen again. The moment, the creative, in whatever the word is, flood had exhausted itself. Now, in a sense, I think that's, in another way, reading it is a bit like that. That's not true of all her works. I mean, I mentioned before, I particularly like her stories, because they are, in my view, in some ways more finely crafted.
More controlled.
Yeah, more controlled, and simply the idea is smaller, and therefore the loss of control is less. Now, there's a sense in which, well, seriously, these questions of form are quite interesting. I mean, I think it's another whole discussion. We haven't got time for it. But, I mean, I think there's decided successful novels amongst Christina's output, and some that are not so good, let's say. And I don't think it's wrong to say that either. I mean, we've been talking about, I think, the great ones and the ones that you'll really enjoy if you haven't already enjoyed them. But there are some that I think are a bit insubstantial in the concept. Other ones that do the vitality of the characters leads to a lot of formlessness at times. I mean, I don't think that's wrong to say that, in my view. People might take issue with that. But the great books that she wrote are there. But I think you do have to immerse yourself in them, go with the tide, with the current, as she did in the writing of them.
Another question.
To follow on the last one, all that doesn't explain why she wasn't explored on university syllabuses. Are we saying that the university teachers are also lazy readers?
That's very true, and I did want to also address that. I mean, we have to look at what happened with the rise of Australian literary studies and its sad demise. An awful lot of what was accepted on the canon was because writers consciously contributed to Australianness and Australian subjects, and Christina had gone away and had fundamentally not written about it. And, I had this problem with Australian literary studies myself, in that, having not been born here, though I came here at the age of 13, by and large, what kind of place I've had in that hierarchy has been moderated through a sort of filter that you don't really belong, really. And people had that view of Patrick White, and when Patrick first came back, there was a lot of very vicious stuff in the press. He had a terrible battle re-establishing himself here, and was very bitter about it, and very unforgiving of people. Christina wasn't like that, but I think she, likewise,
I think she was hurt by it.
She was hurt by it. They didn't fit the pattern that people wanted. And I think it was one of the weaknesses of the way that Australian literature movement conducted itself.
Look, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, again, it's one of the things, one of the many things I couldn't put in the play, otherwise it would have been 5 hours long. I had to stick to about 70 minutes because I believe in economy of form. But was this whole thing that her going away was almost viewed as a form of cultural disloyalty, really, some word like that, and that she'd gone overseas and made this big name for herself, and who did she think she was? She was just a young woman from Sydney who could type quite well and married her boss and put out a few books. And there was quite a sneery, quite contemptuous tone towards her books by lots of Australian reviewers through the 30s, 40s and 50s, which affected her audience and her standing here.
Yes, another question.
Say, at the ANU in 1969, and we did a special study of Christina Stead.
That's good. That's good.
And of course, that's the very year she went to ANU.
Yes.
I wondered if you'd like to say something about the variations in Stead's narrative style. I'm thinking particularly of novels like A Little Tea, A Little Chat.
Sorry, what is the question?
Variations in style.
Now, have you read A Little Tea, A Little Chat?
I have. Look, I guess I'm not sure if I've perceived your question correctly, but if you were to ask me about the successful books, I feel that of her novels, the ones that to me are most convincing are the ones with some strong emotional source under them, such as The Man Who Loved Children and For Love Alone preeminently, I'm Dying Laughing, to some extent Cotter's England. I think A Little Tea, A Little Chat and some of the other ones are a bit more slight, to be honest with you. There's something a little bit less felt in my terms, and it's a highly subjective remark, a bit less felt and a bit less urgent in the impulse behind them. And there's something I think the style in that one is a bit relaxed and a bit bland and a bit sort of New Yorkerish in a way that I don't particularly want to get from Christina Stead, to be honest with you. A lot of other writers can write in a New Yorkerish way. I just wish she hadn't, really.
Well, I agree with that, but I want to take up what I take to be a kind of assumption underlying the question. I think there are certain writers who always write in the same voice, like kind of Ernest Hemingway is one of those. But there are a great many writers, and on the whole I think greater writers, who write in many voices. And why not? Because you've got to interest yourself. And when you've done one book, the next one may well be in a completely different sort of voice. And I think that New Yorkerish tone is a very good way of describing that. It's something she could do. It was a kind of exercise of another.
Well, look, she was a virtuoso,
yes,
right?
She was going to try this out. She can do that. You know, I mean.
Look, to me, one of the. Sorry, this is really rude interruption. But one of the most amazing things in her life, I think, was this: that when she went to London, when she was 26, she got a publisher, Peter Davies, when she was 32, 1934, and she had her book 7 Poor Men of Sydney. Now he was absolutely struck with it. Said it was a wonderful book, which I think it is. But he said, look, I don't think that's a good first book to put out with a title as local as Sydney. We're now in London in 1934. He said, can you write me another book which I will publish first? Now this is very interesting. This shows something quite remarkable, I think, about her wish to please, her practical sense, and her brilliance as a writer. She'd been to the Salzburg Music Festival and decided to write a book a bit like the Canterbury Tales called the Salzburg Tales. Now, she wrote that book in about 4 months. She wrote a story a day. She'd write the story completely, and the next day she'd write what she called the connective tissue between the stories, and then she'd write another story. So in about 4 months she had written what her publisher wanted. This book did not spring from some deep emotional impulse, but it's quite a brilliant book in terms of style, and it was done. It was published first. The first written book, 7 Poor Men of Sydney, came next. She had 2 books out in the same year and made quite a brilliant literary debut. Now, that says something to me quite remarkable about her brain power and her versatility and her energy, and that's a lot of Christina Stead.
Hasn't this been fantastic? Thank you, Rodney Hall. Thank you, Darryl Emerson,
Thank you.
for enlightening us and making us go back to the books, and that's the most important thing. And thank you for coming, and thank you for sharing this evening with us. It's been great. Thank you.
Thank you.